Welcome everybody to this evening's lecture on Karol Wojtyła's The Jeweler Shop. This is a continuation of our effort to understand the play after our production last weekend to 4 sold-out audiences. We were happy to see the interest in the play. And we planned on inviting our speaker to follow up with some commentary on the meaning of the play. As you know, the play has so many rich passages in it. It does bear a second and third reading and much discussion. So I would like to introduce to you first one of the members of the John Paul II Advisory Group, Sister Damian Marie Savino. She is a member of the Franciscan Sisters of the Eucharist. She is an assistant professor at the University of St. Thomas with a joint appointment in environmental science and Catholic studies. And Dr. Casarella was one of her directors for her dissertation at the Catholic University of America. So she knows his work and will do a great job introducing him for us. Sister.
Thank you very much, John. I am delighted to introduce Dr. Casarella. He is a professor of Catholic Studies at DePaul University in Chicago, where he's also the director for the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology. He received his PhD in Religious Studies at Yale University, and his dissertation focused on the theology of the Word of the 15th century Catholic thinker Nicholas of Cusa. And he's going to be giving a talk related to this tomorrow, a colloquium in the philosophy department here. We're keeping him very busy during his time at UST. He spent 2 years as an assistant professor of theology at the University of Dallas, though this is his first visit to Houston. He then assumed a position at the Catholic University of America, where he taught theology for 14 years, and he also directed during that time several dissertations on John Paul II's theology of the body. In 2007, he was appointed a professor in the Catholic Studies program at DePaul University in Chicago. And in 2008, he was named the founding director of DePaul's Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology. In this capacity, he organizes conferences at DePaul on Catholicism and interdisciplinary research. And as John mentioned, he was one of my dissertation advisors and has been a wonderful mentor and has remained a good friend. So I'm most delighted that he was able to accept our invitation to offer this lecture tonight on the Jeweler Shop. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Casarella.
Thank you, Sister Damian Marie, for that very copious and generous introduction. And I'd like to thank Dr. Hittinger for giving me the pleasure and privilege of this invitation and to participate in the very important work of the John Paul II Forum. The title of my presentation is The Proper Weight of Love. The Proper Weight of Love. What can we learn from John Paul II's The Jeweler Shop? The first section is entitled, From the Stage to a Life of Holiness. The stage has not always attracted saints. This problem existed long before entertainment news and the rise of the garish cult of celebrity that pervades our culture. In fact, early Christian writers like Tertullian and St. Augustine adopted Stoic prejudices against the theater, maintaining that the viewing of a dramatic performance aroused the passions in a demonic fashion. Augustine, who as a young pagan was entranced by the catharsis or emotional letting go of drama, called after his conversion for the exclusion of actors from baptism and Eucharist, since, he said, the sublimation of emotions through drama did not serve the proper ends of the passions. Later epochs of Christian history showed a great deal more tolerance. We saw the beginning of Christian theater with medieval mystery plays, with Shakespeare, with the priest playwright of the Spanish Golden Age, Pedro Calderón de la Barca, and the great 20th century French author and diplomat, Paul Claudel, to name just a few of my favorite examples. From this brief synopsis, it's clear that the alliance between the church and the world of the actor has not always been untroubled. But the play we are considering this evening is not the product of a historic struggle between the church and the theater. On the contrary, the jeweler's shop employs the stage as a platform for the free expression of human spirit and a place where the church was called into question. In this case, it is the state and not the church that casts doubt concerning the legitimacy and freedom of the stage actor. Partaking in the theater under the threat of repression was part of a larger struggle to create what George Weigel calls zones of freedom. In 1958, Karol Wojtyła referred to the presence of a theater in Poland that tested the regime and spoke for the people as, quote, the fundamental trial of strength, unquote. Undaunted by the threat of persecution, Karol Wojtyła felt called to the stage in his native Poland. So the actor Wojtyła went underground to a clandestine seminary, even while working at manual labor in a stone quarry and later in a chemical plant. The political persecution was real. Bishops were placed under house arrest, and a fellow seminarian was discovered by the Gestapo and shot. Despite Augustine's warnings, the progression from theater to a life of sanctity appears to have been quite natural. Wojtyła raised the virtue of being a man who could perform on the stage to a new level. In a way, he did attend to Augustine's warning, for in his plays, he took the catharsis out of his drama by forging a form of drama so cerebral that it sounds more like a monologue in a poem by T.S. Eliot than a play. But he was nonetheless schooled in drama and used these skills as instruments to portray the human condition in the light of Christian revelation. All the world's a stage, says Shakespeare famously, and As You Like It. The statement has a meaning and significance in our media-driven culture that Shakespeare could not possibly have anticipated. Blessed John Paul II entered the stage of the world and transformed it into an altar. Some commentators highlighted the Polish Pope's ease on the world stage as if it could be understood in the same way we understand other public spectacles. The Pope as rock star is not an uncommon epithet. The first World Youth Days were panned by some critics as little more than media hype. He was likewise called the Media Pope, the Pilgrim Pope, the Pope who brought down communism. While accurate, none of those labels capture the essence of his own mode of presentation as a Christian actor in history. These labels ignore how his understanding of his own life, and especially his unique vocation as an actor who accepted a vocation to the priesthood, shed light on his role on the world as a stage. Blessed Pope John Paul II was the opposite of a televangelist. He did not promote his public persona in order to gain a bigger platform. He performed this transformation in word and in deed. He preached the silence of the word to make us more self-aware and meditative. He kissed the ground upon landing at every airport so that within the din and flurry of the news cycle, we would have a global gallery manifesting the richness and unity of the Catholic faith. The actor turned pope believed that the artist has a crucial role in speaking on behalf of the spirit of a people to address the ills in society. He states, quote, "From chaos there arises the world of the spirit," unquote. These words were actually penned by the great Polish and Lithuanian Romantic poet of the 19th century, Adam Mickiewicz. It's no coincidence that they are also the last words of the letter to artists that Pope John Paul II delivered on Easter Sunday of 1999, adding the following advice to his fellow artists, quote, "These words of Adam Mickiewicz, written at a time of great hardship for his Polish homeland, prompt my hope for you. May your art help to affirm that true beauty which, as a glimmer of the Spirit of God, will transfigure matter, opening the human soul to the sense of the eternal," unquote. The artist writes for a people and has the daunting task of affirming beauty and seeking to transfigure all of material reality. Lifting the spirit in the midst of hardship is not a function of human genius, according to the Polish Pope. It comes from being open to the work of the Redeemer in the concrete conditions of one's work and one's life. How does eternity break into the musical score, the carved stone, the fragile composition of poetic verses, the sweat and toil of the manual labor, the struggle to love and be loved? This line of thinking brings us to the center of Pope John Paul II's meditation on art, as well as to the central question of his play, namely, how does God's own artisanship as a redeemer of a sinful humanity enter into our daily lives? Before turning to these questions about art, faith, and human existence, let's first examine more fully the context in which the young Karol Wojtyła produced the jeweler's shop. So, a brief section on the Polish underground theater and the jeweler's shop. Let the theater be a church where the national spirit will flourish. A 19-year-old Karol Wojtyła wrote these words with the aim of convincing a friend to start a theater company in Krakow. He had been involved with amateur theater since the age of 8. His literary studies at the Jagiellonian University were probably intended to help him with a career in the theater. The Jeweler's Shop was published in 1960, but maintains the style of the rhapsodic theater, which during the years 1941 to 45 had produced 7 plays, gave 22 performances, and held over 100 rehearsals, in spite of having to put its members in grave danger with the ruling authorities, both German and Russian. Wojtyła was very close to the director of the Rhapsodic Theater and wrote as late as 1967 that he considered their style of theater to be his own. This theater was his home before he discerned a vocation to the priesthood and remained close to his heart, even as a pope. Speaking in 1979 in his trip to Poland, John Paul II said that Mieczysław Kotlarczyk, the director of this company, considered the spoken word and the theater to be my calling. But our Lord Jesus thought it was the priesthood, and somehow we came to accept this. As a result of the connection with the Rhapsodists, the production of the plays was deliberately sparse, a theatrical decision which was more than a function of the circumstances of being underground. Wojtyła aimed for a symbolic realism that countered naturalism. His characters were not meant to be formless abstractions, but also not meant to display the rawness of human emotion. There's a fine line here between presenting types, like the character of Adam in the jeweler's shop, while also offering a precise, almost clinical portrayal of the depth of the human spirit. In philosophical terminology, he's practicing a phenomenology of the inner life. The characters profile what it means to be human when being human is understood as having a link to eternity. The characters, as Paul Fortunato has convincingly argued earlier in the series, are like icons. Their form of representation of the inner life of the human being is more like that of a window than a painting. The words are not complex, but they have a precision to them. The words are, if you will, the stained glass of these windows and provide the basic contours of the performance itself. The philosopher Kenneth L. Schmitz writes, and I quote, "In a traditional theater, the word accompanies the other elements which surround it as part of the total theatrical action. Whereas, in the theater of the word, it is the word that frames the whole." Seldom have playwrights allowed the exigencies of the word to dictate so starkly the method of dramatic presentation. In his essay, On the Theater of the Word, Wojtyła defends the stark intellectualism of the craft he adopted as his own. Here's a lengthy quote, but it's actually pretty pertinent to what we're going to discuss. He states, "Rhapsodic intellectualism expresses itself not only in content, but also in the form of performance. Generally speaking, the theatrical effects are attractively sparse, and when they are not sparse, they are different. Again, we must return to the word as a pre-element, separated as an expression of thought rather than integrated into action. The word proclaimed, an idea proclaimed with a living word. With this in mind, the arrangement of representational elements seems to be strictly limited. Sound effects must predominate. But the rhapsodic theater does not confine itself to them. So visual elements are employed, but they all serve the word. The gestures employed in the rhapsodic theater, mime elements, music and scenery, static and dynamic means, all these develop from the word, flow from it, complement and enhance it. The word and thought are served through the structure of performances, their construction and realization. End of quote. In other words, words are communicated to reveal the dramatic structure of thought. The student of phenomenology believed that words are a path back to the things themselves. The priest called to live a life that mediated the word of God, submitted to the reason, to the logos of that word, to make himself a child of God. In the theater of the word, a modern approach to philosophical objectivity and an ancient biblical faith in divine reason converge. Now, I'd like to turn now to the play itself, and in doing so, to demonstrate a progression in the play from an attention to symbolic words, a kind of philosophy of language in Act 1, to a philosophy of action in Act 2, to a theology of marriage in the third act. The progression can be found in the text. In any case, it's also a helpful way to show some connections, some interesting connections, between the play and other writings of the young Karol Wojtyła. Now, I take it that many of you, if not all of you, have seen the performance in the Obsidian art space directed by Guy Shafts. For those who are not familiar with the plot, the lack of overt action makes for a brief synopsis. Each act introduces a couple about to face the prospect of marriage. In each act, the couple approaches the window of a jeweler's shop and are forced to ponder the weight of their love, which is symbolized dramatically by the weighing of the marriage rings by the mysterious jeweler. In the first act, Andrew and Teresa celebrate an unexpected love, a blissful and sturdy union later cut short when Andrew dies on the front and leaves Teresa to raise their child, Christopher, all alone. The focus in the second act is a couple that survives the war but faces even greater difficulties due to their indifference to one another and growing resentment. The problems of Stefan and Anna are inherited by their daughter, Monica. In the third act, we thus meet Christopher and Monica at the brink of their betrothal. Will the scars of their past prove too great an obstacle to marriage? Can they be redeemed by their love, and can they redeem a past for which they are not responsible? These are the questions they face as they peer into the window of the jeweler's shop. Act 1, a poet of interior words. The first act is especially rich in what Kenneth Schmidt's terms the symbolic realism of the theater of the word. Rhapsodic realism requires rhythms. It does not remain static. In this case, the characters oscillate between the fleetingness of their absorption in the mundane. I was looking for high-heeled shoes, states Teresa at one point, and their attraction through self-giving love to the infinite. The latter is evidenced in Andrew's decision, quote, to seek a woman who would be indeed my real alter ego, so that the bridge between us would not be a shaky footbridge among water lilies and reeds, unquote. The newly encountered reality of marital love forces the couple to question whether and how time and eternity meet. The starkness of the oscillation between time and eternity in Act 1 contrasts with the seeming permanency of the fate that befalls Andrew when he later dies on the front. Christopher, in Act 3, becomes the heir to this paradox. The poet, playwright, crafts symbols that are equally concrete and abstract. Clocks, signals, rings, scales, and a mirror. Teresa opens the play by saying, and I quote, Andrew has chosen me and asked for my hand. It happened today between 5 and 6 in the afternoon. I don't remember exactly. I had no time to look at my watch or catch a glimpse of the clock on the tower of the old town hall. At such moments, one does not check the hour. Such moments grow in one above time, end of quote. The watch represents chronological time, the time that passes regardless of our level of interest. But this moment will grow within. It will be transformed by an interior dimension of time into the time of memory. The focus on the choice made by Andrew and its profound but serene impact on Teresa's interiority removes the memory from the typical record of a love at first sight. She turns inward rather than jumping for joy. Such images reinforce the need to think about time. At the moment of betrothal, Andrew gazes at the road ahead. At the moment of betrothal, Andrew gazes at the road ahead rather than at Teresa to make this point. Likewise, the craftsmanship in the jeweler's shop is described as strange, and I quote, to produce objects that can stimulate reflection on fate, to gild watches, for instance, which measure time and tell man about the transience of all things and their passing, end of quote. The signals represent a different kind of symbol. I'm told that at the Obsidian Art Space, animals surrounded Andrew and Teresa as they huddled and listened to the voice of this creature. The reference in the text to a specific range of mountains in southeastern Poland makes it likely that this image carried a meaning for Father Wojtyła and the little family of friends that we will never grasp. But the importance of the signal is clear, at first more to Teresa than to Andrew. But he too comes to see that this mysterious voice intervened in his life to help him discern his destiny with Teresa. The fullness of nature's secrets, in the sense of being in harmony with the world's totality, contrasts with man's being off balance and loss. Teresa's faith in the signals and willingness to readily embrace Andrew's unexpected proposal help Andrew to find his bearings. The mysteriousness of the signals remind us that Wojtyła's world is a semiotic world, a world of limitless signs in which abstract characters are searching for a concrete form of solidarity that will allow them to transcend the transience of life. Andrew states, "Several years later, I see it clearly that roads which should have diverged have brought us closer together. Those years have been invaluable, giving us time to get our bearings on the complicated map of signs and signals. It must be so. Today I see that my country is also her country, and after all, I dreamed of through a bridge," end of quote. So the signals are an inchoate word from the created order, a clear but indistinct message from beyond the realm of daily chatter, a message that one can place one's trust in providence to uncover a path of meaning and of communion. Presence is another major theme in the first act, namely how marital love makes one palpably present to one's betrothed, and how the absolute silently becomes present in our midst. Teresa and Andrew see their reflections intermingle in the mirror of the jeweler's shop, and this brief glance symbolizes the new communion they will share. More significantly, Andrew recognizes that the strange persistence of Teresa and me is not only a form of presence, but carries with it what he calls that feeling you ought to. That feeling you ought to. Now, the philosopher Wojtyła had struggled with the philosophical question of affection and moral norms in the thought of Max Scheler. Here we see the beginning of a response to the Schelerian negation of normativity. The feeling of the presence of another within the sphere of one's own ego moves beyond sentimentality. As in the sacrament, the play uses rings to symbolize an indissoluble bond. Given the subtitle, it is striking that the use of overt references to the sacrament is confined to this one highly expressive image. The words of Andrew carry the same message as the image of rings. Affect and a normative bond coexist in marriage. Presence carries with it duties, but the recognition of the objective ought in a commitment of love does not in any way diminish love's attractiveness. The gaze of the jeweler is another central image in the first act. It has been compared to conscience, to the presence of the absolute, and even to the pastor and confessor, the young Father Wojtyła. However one construes the image, it ties cosmic signals together with the inscape of the heart. And here I quote, "We found ourselves not only on the level of his gaze, but also on the level of his life. Our whole existence stood before him. His eyes were flashing signals which we were not able to receive fully just then, as once we had been unable to receive fully the signals in the mountains. And yet, they reached to our inner hearts. And somehow we went in their direction, and they covered the fabric of our whole lives." End of quote. The gaze is a mirror that repeats the reflection seen in front of the jeweler's shop. The gaze introduces seeing and being seen. It connects the need for memory with the bond of communion. By allowing the gaze of the Absolute into their hearts, they are committing to a path that will encompass their lives and lead them together to the edge of eternity. I have emphasized in this reading of the first act how Wojtyła combines poetry with drama. We see the craft of a man who, by inward disposition, mixed poetry and drama. The subtitle of this work is, in my opinion, no understatement, but a frank admission of this deliberate mixing of genres. A meditation on the sacrament of matrimony, passing, on occasion, into drama. The young Wojtyła was a poet who understood something about words. He not only crafted words into vibrant and profound images, but he searched within his soul for the right words that could proclaim the witness of Jesus Christ in history. Francis Cardinal George, in his book, The Difference God Makes, explains the importance of Wojtyła's approach to language, not only in the poetry of his youth, but also in his pontificate. Poles, Cardinal George writes, admired the Pope not only as a native son who returned to a hero's welcome, but also as a master of the Polish tongue. His presence was not just as an orator. His presence celebrating Mass in Victory Square in downtown Warsaw on June 2nd, 1979, paved the way for the unshackling of a trade union known as Solidarność, and eventually Poland's liberation from the Soviet Union. In other words, Blessed Pope John Paul II spoke in deed as well as in word. The poet submitted to the word so that his words could carry a message of enduring value. Act 2, Love and Responsibility. The second act is entitled The Bridegroom and focuses on the bitterness and disillusionment felt by Anna in her troubled marriage with Stefan. I realize now that for staging and other reasons, the production of the second and third acts here in Houston focused on the intensity of Anna's human experience rather than on the bridegroom motif. And I understand that there's a lot of discussion about that. But in this talk, I'm going to focus on the original text, since that's what I had, and then we can see where the discussion goes. But, in fact, I want to highlight also that the quest for love in these two acts, as human experiences, is one that is very bittersweet, precisely because these experiences make us aware that the act of marriage is changed when selfishness overtakes the necessary openness to transcendence. So that the vertical dimension of marriage in the play appears in the horizontal relationships, which isn't to deny its own sense of verticality. I'll come back to that at the end. Here one can frame the issues even more precisely by taking into account that Wojtyła published a lengthy philosophical analysis of betrothed love in the same year and in the same journal that he published the play. In fact, the 2 years prior to 1960, the year of publication of The Jeweler's Shop, were taken up with lectures and discussions with married couples of the chapters of this book. Writing about this book, Love and Responsibility, papal biographer George Weigel states, quote, "A philosophical complement to the issues he explored dramatically in The Jeweler's Shop, it exemplified Wojtyła's conviction that one could only get to the truth of things by a variety of methods." Now, the staging you chose allows for the display of an intensity of emotions as Anna confronts herself, Adam, and the chorus. All of this, even the surrounding of Anna by the chorus until her scream gets them to disperse, contributes to the profound disclosure of the nature of love. Love, we have learned from Act 1, is about the conscious presence of another in and with oneself. In Act 2, the absence of that experience reveals to Anna the rift between consciousness and reality. Anna is the perfect example of Wojtyła's intellectualism. She hardly dwells on the possibility of infidelity by her husband. Not that that didn't wound her, but that's not the focus of her self-presentation. Instead, she recognizes that the walls of her interior had become empty. Stefan no longer reacts to me, she says to herself. He is no longer present in me. And yet, though I now exist for myself, I am no longer at home in myself. The fullness of communion that joins Andrew and Teresa stands in stark contrast to the empty, egotistical self Anna discovers through her dialogue with Adam in the chorus. She is not too self-absorbed to lose sight altogether of her eternal destiny. In fact, the main point of the second act is the disproportion between a being at one, being fulfilled with the perfect bridegroom, and Anna's feeling of not being at home even with herself. Wojtyła remains a realist. No one can experience in marital love the perfect love of God, but the objective fact of communion with our Creator is the final form and the most comprehensive norm for taking stock of both love and marriage. How does this relate to the work Love and Responsibility? Because of her honesty and willingness to struggle with Adam and the chorus to see for herself what really happened in her marriage, Anna expresses what Wojtyła in Love and Responsibility calls, quote, the paradox of betrothed love. The love of man and woman in marriage must be considered in relationship to other forms of love like desire, attraction, goodwill, comradeship, and friendship. All forms of love bear a relationship to one another and to the good of human flourishing. But betrothed love, he writes, is unique. He states, its decisive character is the giving of one's person to another. The essence of betrothed love is self-giving, the surrender of one's I, end of quote. Betrothed love is a vocation to give not something or some part of oneself, but one's whole self to another. Medieval theologians, he continues, express the paradox by saying the person is always, of its very nature, untransferable, alteri incommunicabilis. In the natural order, he continues, it makes no sense to speak of a person giving himself or herself to another, especially if this is meant in the physical sense, end of quote. If we are, as persons, untransferable, then we can never become the property of another. But in establishing the norm of mutual self-giving, one is asked to hand over everything one has and is. The gospel verse, Matthew 10:39, offers a clue. He who would save his soul shall lose it, and he who would lose his soul for my sake shall find it again. The laws of the world of persons need to be broadened to encompass the evangelical norm of total self-giving. Sexual difference and unconditioned reciprocity figure into the self-giving of betrothed love in essential ways. But the norms drawn from finite experience are elevated by the supernatural gift revealed as unconditioned love. Anna's struggle is the result of entering into the paradox. She recognizes in the recognition of the face of her husband Stefan on the face of the bridegroom that she despairs because both spouses have failed in self-giving. Act 3, Love, Death, and Nuptiality. If the first act gives expression to the poetic acumen of the young Wojtyła, and the second to his metaphysics of responsibility, then by the same token we can say that the third act orders a glimpse, and only a glimpse, of the future theologian of the body. The text that we know as the Theology of the Body is not in the jeweler's shop, but the third act gives us some sense of how these insights were developing before the mature form of Theology of the Body took shape. In the text of Act 3, there is a reunion. The third couple, Christopher and Monica, are joined by Teresa, Adam, Anna, and even Stefan. Adam, a spokesman and a judge, represents the inward voice of conscience and the better judgment of the rest of humanity. Monica and Christopher must endure his opinions about their union as well as those of all the surviving parents. It would not be a complete parody to retitle this act All in the Family or Thanksgiving Dinner with the In-Laws. More seriously, the gathering of persons and experiences is really just a reflection of what has already been absorbed into the mirror of the window of the jeweler's shop. The external gathering of actors appears on the stage. Below the surface, there is a deeper internal gathering of memories. Christopher has only, quote, the idea of a father, unquote, imparted to him by his mother Teresa. Monica remembers that there was no real union binding her parents, so she wonders whether she can inherit something other than their egoism. Or alternatively, she asks, is she just a girl who absorbs more than you, Christopher, can give, perhaps, and herself gives most sparingly? Anna's memories reach back to her earlier meeting with Adam and force her to revisit the encounter with the bridegroom. Teresa's memories are the most ample. She has come full circle, from a timid fiancée surprised by a betrothal to a widow whose life is now absorbed by the future union of her son. Even the jeweler is represented as being filled with the lives of many people. Memory in Act 3 represents the horizontal concentricity of spousal love. To find one's place in this web of experiences is always subjective. Fear and hope accompany these thoughts. Each character must face a different fate within this constellation of experiences. No man is an island. Christopher speaks for the group when he says, quote, all that we must leave behind and make our fate from scratch. Love is a constant challenge thrown to us by God. Thrown, I think, so that we should challenge fate. In other words, marriage needs both memory and freedom. Now, just very briefly, because I think this is just to provoke discussion more than anything else, the theology of the body, as many of you know, is based upon a triangle. There's the Trinitarian communion of persons of God, there's the human experience of self-giving love, and there's the nuptial or spousal symbolism of the body. The bridegroom motif is present in Acts 2 and 3 of the text, but it is not an isolated, wholly supernatural overlap. Elements of this triangle, triune love, personal self-giving, and nuptial symbolism, can be seen throughout the jeweler's shop. The most important theological connection, however, is that in both texts, jeweler's shop and theology of the body, the horizontality of love, here seen in memory, and the verticality of love are allowed to intersect. There is no cross in the jeweler's shop, except inasmuch as the jeweler unveils this connection to each of the characters in terms of his or her own personal struggle. Redemptive love then becomes a possibility in the middle of existence. That's something we can talk more about, but I want to now turn to what I promised I would talk about, and that is the meaning of the jeweler shop today, or what would the jeweler say to us today? Bishop Wojtyła used real couples to create the characters in the play. One of the couples in his inner circle of friends even had a child named Monica. The realism of the emotions and the authenticity of the language undoubtedly derive from the young priest's attentive pastoral care with real people. It has been suggested that the jeweler represents the good shepherd, a young Wojtyła, but it's not necessary to make that connection nor to see the figure of the jeweler as a cipher for the wisdom we need even today in addressing our situation. The jeweler weighs rings, and these rings can express a spousal love more permanent than mere emotion. What can this teach us today? Can young people today learn something from what the young Wojtyła wrote about the proper weight of love? First and foremost, there is a timelessness to the conviction that responsible people enter into marriage with a vision of partaking of an indissoluble bond. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. So in spite of the sparseness of the play, Blessed John Paul II crafted a dramatic form for this truth, that carries an appeal that transcends its age. The symbolism of the weighing of the rings and the concept of the proper weight of man lie at the heart of the drama. In the second act, the jeweler explains to Anna that her ring weighs nothing, nor would her absent husband's ring weigh anything. She says, "My jeweler's scales have this peculiarity, that they weigh not the metal, but man's entire being and fate." In that same scene, Adam explains to Anna the connection between weight, the whole course of life, and God. He states, "Love is not an adventure. It has the taste of the whole man. It has his weight, and the weight of his whole fate. It cannot be a single moment. Man's eternity passes through it. That is why it is to be found in the dimensions of God, because only he is eternity." End of quote. The term proper weight has also been rendered by some translators as specific gravity, as a very specific scientific term. It derives in this context from elements of St. Augustine and John of the Cross and signifies the moral capacity of a human person to seek out one's final end in a return to the Creator. Eternity encompasses the finitude of a life, not just because of its expansiveness, but because our lives owe their existence to a source or a creator. The embrace of eternity as a personal reality of love is what we implicitly aim to discover when we focus on the weight or specific gravity of our lives. We cannot just look at an isolated snapshot to gain this perspective. We need a view of the whole. That wholeness of a life, as more complete than the sum of its individual parts, is exactly what the concept of proper weight is intended to convey. Besides these timeless theological and philosophical truths, there are three other ways of applying the ideas of the play to our situation today. First, the play teaches us how to confront a growing indifference in our culture with respect to sexuality, marriage, and relationships. Second, the meditation places the discussion of responsible relationships in a new and more profound context. And third, the play is a meditation on the exercise of human freedom. So, on the first point, confronting indifference. And these are more of a personal nature now, to kind of bring it to a close. Since 2007, I've taught in the Department of Catholic Studies at the largest Catholic university in the country. In January, I will once again teach Introduction to Catholicism to young men and women from Chicago and its environs who are enrolled in the colleges of Commerce, Communication, and Computing and Digital Media. Like many of your students, they're almost all commuters. Probably none of them would take this class if they didn't have to fulfill a distributional requirement. Because the sample is relatively random, my views about the religious attitudes of young people today are shaped by this teaching experience. All know about divorce either first, second, or third hand. A few of the students have strong and/or well-informed opinions about the teaching of the Church. Most do not. Most come to class without a pre-existing desire to establish or disestablish traditional Catholicism, to prove the existence of God or dispute it. Passive indifference is the most common denominator. Indifference to religion and morality does not rule out curiosity, criticism, or even open-mindedness. But it seems, at least through the finite lens of this experience, to pervade the lives of young Catholics and non-Catholics alike. A more scientific analysis of the spiritual state of young people has been undertaken by the Notre Dame sociologist Christian Smith. His data reveals that the common denominator is a, quote, moralistic, therapeutic deism. The first term signifies that young people believe that being a good and moral person is important. The third term, deism, is used loosely and signifies that their idea of God is of one who creates the world and then stays distant from it. The form of deism as applied here is barely theism. It's the antithesis of the Christian conviction that God acts in history, that God acts in our lives. Therapeutic ideas of religion condition both morality and the idea of God. Like a combination divine butler and cosmic therapist, he writes, the God of young people makes no demands about objective transgressions like sin or the formation of specific habits to promote virtue or a life of prayer. Smith gives a more nuanced and scientifically grounded account of what I have termed indifferentism, but the upshot is basically the same. Choices about sexuality and choices about faith are only taken seriously if one has already made a decision to treat one's life as something other than a calculus for profit and pleasure. Too many people, it seems, are not living up to that very basic measure. The jeweler's shop is a quiet but decisive declamation of indifferentism and a direct refutation of moralistic therapeutic deism. Father Wojtyła had heard many confessions from couples whom he had befriended. He was their Adam. In this way, he knew their personal struggles as well as they did. When the three couples look into the mirror of the jeweler's shop, each one is faced with a choice. They examine not only their psychological profiles, but the act of choosing and their openness to communion. When the jeweler shares his gaze with them, they stop being bystanders. No one can remain indifferent to the weighing of the rings or to the presence in the gaze. Like a confessor, the jeweler renders a judgment only on what has been examined in conscience. The drama lies not in the verdict on the scales, but in the reaction in front of the mirror. Teresa refers to that strange mirror. That strange mirror pervades the consciousness of the characters because it represents the moral drama of self-reflection. Unlike relativism, the examination of conscience here through a moral mirror is not just the revelation of the standpoint of an individual. The play awakens both individual and social conscience. It offers an invitation to participate in communion with a beloved as seen in and through one's solitary relationship with the infinite. So, second point, what is a responsible relationship? While many of the students in my classes have trouble finding their spiritual moorings, all are interested in garnering wisdom about relationships. I taught a class in the Theology of the Body because the students demanded that such a course be added to the curriculum. It was really an amazing kind of voice from the people that they asked that this class be added to their curriculum. And in it, I had 6 young women and 1 Franciscan candidate for the priesthood. Doesn't that figure? They told me that they wanted to learn about what the Catholic Church could teach them about relationships, especially for those who are single. The jeweler's shop uses the indirect method of drama, this instrumentality of drama, to raise crucial questions about what it means to exercise responsibility in relationships. You have to examine your psychological and social profile to see how memories constitute and condition your own capacity for self-giving. You must also attend at the same time to a life of prayer to ask whether God's own gift of love has entered into your life and elevated your capacity for loving responsibly. Looking at love through the lens of relationships is dangerously Pelagian. Moreover, the relationship system described by sociologist Barbara Defoe Whitehead in her book, Why There Are No Good Men Left, hooking up in college, treating marriage and cohabitation as experiments on equal footing. This relationship system is the exact opposite of what Karol Wojtyła envisioned. Wojtyła, the philosopher, created characters who could teach us about the metaphysical constitution of the human person. Love is a constant challenge thrown to us by God. If you want to be in a responsible relationship, you need to examine how that statement applies to your life. Finally, we can learn something about the relationship between freedom, absolute existence, and interpersonal communion. The jeweler's shop also teaches us timely lessons about freedom, a highly cherished value in our society, and one that is frequently divorced from truth. Cardinal George, in The Difference God Makes, tells a charming story about his parents that recapitulates a central theme of the jeweler's shop. The cardinal says that his mother, when he was a child, his mother took him to shop for clothes for his father. She would tell the young man, her son, what his father would like and what he would not like. And in the end, he reports, she was always right. The point he tries to make is that the communion of his parents' love, is a form of existence, and we're not just side by side. We indwell one another. Francis Cardinal George has this memory of his mother, and he has the memory of her love for his father within himself. His mother knew his father better than the father knew himself, and he carries that memory forward for himself and also in his ministry. Being in communion often feels like an abdication of freedom. I myself am not very good about letting my wife shop for me. I want my freedom. Nevertheless, Christian marriage, religious life, and the Eucharist are all signs of contradiction in our highly individualistic society. We must release ourselves to be in communion, and the jeweler's shop allows us to contemplate just that path of discovery. Once again, the relationship between human self-giving and the gift of absolute love is critical. Conclusion. How does God's own artisanship as a redeemer of sinful humanity enter into our daily lives? I began with this question. Hopefully, the contours of a response have now begun to emerge. This may seem an odd way to end this reflection, since neither God nor Jesus Christ are mentioned by name in this or any other of Wojtyła's plays. The play, Taborski reminds us, imposes no theological solutions. This judgment seems to address the very open-ended speech by Stefan at the end that was eliminated in the recent production in order to highlight Teresa's statement that Monica and Christopher reflect in some way absolute existence and love. In any case, the jeweler's shop teaches us, to repeat the words of Christopher, that the new pain of love is also a pain of a new birth. I hope and pray that we may all grow to grasp the beauty and creativity of that form of renewal, that the new pain of love is also a pain of new birth. I find it profound and enriching, but it's also a universal message offered by Blessed Pope John Paul II for the consideration of the entire world. Thank you very much for your consideration.
I think that loving God or having a relationship with God reflects in the relationship you will have on a personal level. And if a young person doesn't start to develop that in a conversational way, in a relationship way with God, it's very difficult in today's world to overcome the selfishness. And as it relates to Anna, I found that as she was speaking, it was all about Anna. A great deal of what she had to say was about what she was getting, what she wasn't getting from the relationship. And when one reflects on God's unconditional love, the more young people realize what that is and apply that to the relationship, and they both give, it's a natural consequence that they'll have a beautiful love, along with theology of the body, which, of course, dovetails with that. So the importance of having that relationship is something that needs to be stressed for their own good, not just as a theological or a Catholic thing, but that's really what God is asking, and He's asking for a much better life because He loves the young people. So if they could realize that, I think it would be helpful. It's helpful to them. It's not an exercise. It's how to love that He's relating.
Thank you. I mean, what I might just add as a footnote to that is that I don't want to reduce the reading of the play too much to, today and make it all very present, because it's obviously very rich in its own context and has many rich symbols that can go in many directions. But what you say just makes the point that so many of the young people today are children of divorce or nieces and nephews of divorce and are experiencing the situation of Monica and Christopher. And so you were talking about the self-involvement of Anna and then the process of reflection she goes through, but then that's carried over into the third act for both Monica and Christopher. And I see a lot of the struggles that young people are going through in that transference and in that memory.
And I began thinking more in Augustinian terms about caritas and cupiditas, the vectors of amor sui and amor dei, but it didn't seem to work out along those ways. And in some sense, the Augustinian drift is either muted or reconfigured, redirected toward this interpersonalist sense of communion you emphasized. And do you see in the play a decisive movement away from a kind of, I don't know what to call it, an Augustinian didacticism in the play in favor of something that is decisively less preachy, for lack of a better term?
That's a hard, but obviously very good and an important question to answer. You obviously, coming at it from love and responsibility, you could get more concrete responses. I think that you're right, of course, that the Pondus Amoris is Augustinian in Wojtyła's own mind. I mean, he had been lecturing on those topics in the years prior to writing the play and prior to writing Love and Responsibility. There's also the question about the degree to which his reading of John of the Cross, he'd written a dissertation on faith according to John of the Cross, then becomes the vehicle for his own Augustinian understanding of love. But I'll just mention, so you're right, the track that you're proposing is obviously very important. I would mention two things in that regard. There's also a parallel to a speech in Antigone about the wonder of man, and that was a play that I believe he translated, but he certainly knew the Greek tragedians to the same degree that he knew Augustine, and so there is this universality there that is not Augustinian, that resonates in this phrase, the specific gravity or weight. That's something to consider. That the other obvious point is that comes across more clearly in Love and Responsibility is the degree to which he's thinking about the metaphysical constitution of personhood in Thomist terms, and that he's following a revision of Augustinian theology in light of that. But it would take a different form of a lecture to go into that. But I think all of those resonances are there.
Thank you very much. A wonderfully thoughtful lecture. So I just have a couple of questions on some points, but I can't get into the depth of your understanding of this play. The first one is more historical, and I don't know whether you know it, about it or not, but I don't. That has to do with the rhapsodic theater in Kotelarczyk, and whether this, what you call symbolic realism that Wojtyła uses in this play, is that quite characteristic of the rhapsodic theater that was existing during World War II and that he was a part of?
Well, I gave you a quote in which he, in '67, I believe, said that was his own method of his plays. Now, not all of his plays are written in that vein. The earlier plays are clearly not. But it seemed to legitimate that when he was writing, because he, as a bishop, wrote reviews of their plays that were fairly laudatory, under the pseudonym of, there's a whole question about André Javin and the pseudonym that he used, and these all appear together in Snack, and so he continued to support them even as a bishop. So there is, I think, that his essays on the theater of the word are writing as a kind of theater critic about them. But when he says that this was coming back to Poland, it was 79, coming back to Poland, 79, saying about Kotelarczyk that his method was my own. I mean, he's pretty much revealing, playing his cards there. Okay. So that was the connection I was making. But I mean, there could be more to it than that.
Okay. Now I have a question about the play itself, and I want to thank you for I haven't read it. I've just seen the production here. So dividing it into the three acts, I mean, that was fairly clear because of the three couples. Now, I just have a broad question, but I would ask that perhaps you might give some degree of an answer to it, and that is sort of looking at these three couples globally, all right, as a whole, each one of them. How are we supposed to see the? Is there a progression in the play? It's clear that the second couple, their marriage has failed. Now, my question is, the first couple, Andrew and Teresa, seemed to be fine. It was just tragic that he died. So my real question, I suppose, is, okay, you've got in the second act a kind of love which doesn't work, but how should we compare the love that you find in the first act with the first couple, and then the love that you're going to find in their children? Are those similar, or are they different in some way? Is there some sort of progression? I'm thinking, is this Hegelian? Have we got thesis, antithesis, synthesis? I just don't understand how to relate the first and the third.
It's not Hegelian.
Pardon me?
It's not Hegelian.
Okay. I didn't think it would be.
That much I would say with certitude.
Yeah.
Everything else is up for grabs. No, it's a very good question. What I was trying to emphasize is that from the get-go, there's this question about time, temporality, and how there is, in the objective constitution of the human heart, in Thomistic terminology, a desiderium naturale that evinces itself in the sacrament of matrimony, passing over occasionally to drama. From the very first speech of Teresa, she's talking about clocks and watches and the time of day in which she met Andrew. And the business about the shopping and the high heels, I thought was very striking, that she kind of reveals her own superficiality and the fact that she didn't think he was going to propose, and she's kind of twitting about and then accepting very quickly the proposal. So there is this sense in the opening act that these are very temporal people. And that contrasts with the stark suddenness of Andrew dying in the front. This kind of light, open superficiality. So that when she opens the third act, she's burdened with trying to figure out who Monica is, trying to figure out how her son is going to be with this woman. And so the third act, as I tried to develop, is then about how everyone, all three of them, in very different ways, are undergoing temporal development and are relating or trying to find within their hearts, trying to find within their inscape some relationship to eternity, positive or negative. So I think that it's not Hegelian. And I know Wojtyła criticized Blondel, but there is this sense of the word grows, the word emerges, the word takes on incarnate form in history. In small histories, these sometimes superficial and sometimes selfish couples are showing us the progression of the word. So in the end, it's not a complete synthesis. That's why I was so adamant about this anti-Hegelianism. But it's not a Kierkegaardian leap of faith. There's a rationality to the word that we can find here. And there's this constant quest. This is where I think he's trying to not be seduced by a certain, maybe not authentic Augustinianism, and trying to find the objective determination that grounds human personhood, even in these plays. So all of the characters, including the one who's absent in Act 2 and then reappears at the very end. I know you didn't stage that, but all of the 6 characters are progressing and undergoing change and trying to find this absolute in themselves. Does that make sense, Ed?
It makes sense, but if you don't mind, I'd like to ask a couple of more questions, all right? I really liked Teresa. So she didn't seem to me to be superficial so much as she was made human by being concerned with ordinary things. But ordinary is not the same thing as superficial. But let's just take your, on your interpretation. I certainly understand the idea of progression, okay? But if you look at the characters, okay, you have to. I just like to know, how is Teresa progressing, and how is Anna progressing, and how is Monica progressing? Because that's the real trouble is with Anna. See, I mean, I don't see Anna progressing at all. Teresa might be progressing some. Monica is a sort of a hope for a fuller love relationship because, you know, you're hoping that her husband won't die in the war or something like that. So I'm just trying to get my hand on the differences amongst the characters because Anna seems so different from Teresa and Monica.
All of what you said is I think, right, and it's fair to point out. See, I don't know what how the staging affected your interpretation, since I didn't see in the production. I think we're relating to slightly different texts, and it would, but we can't go into that here. That wouldn't that would take us too far afield. Well, I mean, I didn't see the production. That's what I'm trying to say, and so we're relating to different texts. I think that. Well, let me just highlight one thing you said and then add something. What you said about ordinary lives is absolutely right on target in my reading. That Wojtyła not only interacted with couples, this circle, and then used that as his material in writing the play. And that's where the realism comes from. Even though they're abstract intellectual concepts, these characters, the fact that he can talk about the shopping and the ordinary lives is very incarnational. It gets very much, I think, to the heart of his theological point. So I'm glad you highlighted that. I think that's, for those of you who worked on the production, I think you probably even have more insights about the characters in that way. And Anna has to be seen in that same light. What I wanted to underscore there is that she's not completely a lost cause, that there seems to be this questioning that arises in her. She's prodded in both Acts 2 and 3 from the outside. I mean, she can't do it. That's what's interesting, is she needs the everyman, the Adam, to awaken in her a question, and it really ends with nothing more than a question. Schmitz, so I wanted to highlight that. Schmitz, in his reading, brings out something that others didn't talk about, and maybe that comes from his own phenomenological prejudices, but that's a whole nother kettle of fish. But he in all these characters emphasizes the difference between consciousness and reality in each of these characters. And the point of that reading, which I think is very interesting, is that before looking in the mirror, a lot of the characters are absorbed in their own ordinariness. A lot of the characters are not able to see the depth of their own being. So the mirror, the gaze of the jeweler, these metaphors, and the play between time and eternity, all of these metaphors show that there's a depth to human existence that is in the ordinary, but has to be opened up, has to be uncovered. And I think Hegelian or not Hegelian, I don't know, but that is also one of the dimensions of this text. And that's part of the intellectualism or abstraction of these characters. They show us that we're all, in our ordinariness, capable of unveiling a profound relationship or question about eternal destiny.
Peter, right here.
I was very much struck in viewing the play with Christopher's comment to Monica when she's doubting whether she's capable of sustained love, etc., and worried about her parents' past and how she wasn't shown what she should have been shown, apparently. And he says, your father once held you, once, I can't remember all the lines. But what I got out of that is that although those are momentary passing things, they don't ever really pass. They're not nothing. They don't disappear because the human beings move on or become, I don't know, but the idea that these concrete moments count for something, and they do open up into eternity if we left them. I don't know if that makes, but that seems to me
Yeah.
to
No,
connect up with
I
what you were
find that to
saying.
be a very helpful clarification, what you just stated. And it gets to the issue about whether Monica is capable of healing the wound she receives from her mother. And then that larger question of whether are Christopher and Monica called to redeem a past for which they're in no way responsible. And that's left very open. I mean, I was playing with, talking about Augustinianism, kind of difference between, in a very Augustinian way, about Memoria time and looking inward and reading that into the text. And I think it's there, but that might have been more my Augustinianism than Wojtyła's. But there is this sense from the beginning that time passes, and until we internalize it, until we begin to ponder its expansiveness and its meaning, it remains merely ordinary.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
tell us what it's really
Wow.
about.
No, that's what I think it's amazing, because all of these discussions that we're having sort of in this intellectual environment, we were having in rehearsal rooms sort of in a different vein, more on the emotional level and the intellectual level. I do have a question, but I was just going to address this gentleman's in like 2 seconds maybe, because the same questions that you had, obviously we had to sit around a table and talk about. Even backstage, we were all wondering what are the different relationships between the three different characters. And one thing that came up was Teresa's character in the relationship was sort of a more mature relationship, and the idea of time being, we're going to wait until everything seems right for us to be together. And they had a long friendship even before they got together. And there is this respect for the jeweler and his significance and the symbolism of not just feeling for one another and giving for one another, but also knowing that perhaps there was a transcendent meaning and union of this, versus the third relationship, which even if when you watch the play, you saw Teresa's reaction to their sort of hasty, it's sort of like, okay, even if it's not right, we're going to get together because I want this and I want you and you want me. And that, I mean, speaking as someone, who's been through a relationship that was perhaps very selfish, sometimes the talk goes like that. It's like, well, let's just do it right, rather than let's think about it, let's pray about it, let's see if the timing is right. So there's a less of a maturity between the first and I think the third. And then Anna is, I think, we were all talking as actors backstage. I mean, everyone loves that scene because so many people are in that situation that Anna is, where you're just so frustrated and you don't know why you can't love. And I think that pain that she feels and struggles with is so relatable to so many people, especially today. My question for you was the chorus, because I was in the chorus. Is there any, do you know anything about how the chorus is used in other productions, or is it just, because we used it in a variety of ways, but do you know anything about how the chorus related to the full story and the action of the play, other than playing like the animals and and scaring people? And
that's a good question. I probably need to do more research on it because I focus more on this play. But I mean, I took it to be like a Greek chorus, and that Adam more easily fits the abstract type of conscience, or the confessor, but the chorus is more everyman than Adam is everyman, I think that there's a sense about the ring and the sacrament of marriage, because this is supposed to be about the sacrament of marriage, sometimes passing over into drama, always has a social context. It's never two people alone, and that's why I kind of played in my reading of the third act with the all in the family motif, because it is something like that. But the more could probably be done on the use of the course in other plays. I don't have anything on that specifically.
Dr. Casarella, thank you very much. I had another Augustinian question, and it was sort of sparked by your comments about both St. Augustine's and Tertullian's fear or dread of the theater. But it caused me to think about the personal drama that St. Augustine presents in the Confessions. And so I was thinking specifically of the lines like, you know, late have I loved you, or you are more interior to me than I am to myself. And I was thinking about that as the drama unfolds over the course of the Confessions, you have this, I mean, St. Augustine sets it up in terms of these wayward desires, these desires that have a proper resting point, but he hasn't hit it yet. And the drama unfolds because he actually has to go through a very extreme intellectualism, through Neoplatonism, before he actually reaches this satisfaction, this resting in the desires. And so I wondered if, with respect to the jeweler shop, and especially the way you exegeted it for us in your talk, if there isn't actually a very central or poignant Augustinianism in the play, because you have these passions, and we're shown the fullness of human passions, but it's sifted or purged through a sort of metaphysical intellectualism, and we're directed to the proper resting place of human love and human desires, etc. So.
That's a very eloquent statement. I would simply, I mean, certainly Augustinianism in some broad sense is there. So I would simply point back to the image of the mirror, and say that, I mean, you don't want to then take the discussion of concupiscence and chastity and love and responsibility and say that's all there just in dramatic form. That would be a little too simple as a reading. But on another level, that is the case, and I mean, they're being written around the same time, and you can certainly look at one and the other. But I think the image of the mirror, in a sense, gets to your question, because the mirror is a kind of Augustinian, in some broad sense, but in some real sense, Augustinian trope, because with their passions, with the ordinariness of their lives, with their struggles and pains, each of the characters looks in the mirror. But the mirror is a very Augustinian mirror, because it bends. It absorbs something of their own selves as they give to one another. And it calls them, particularly in the case of Anna, to see if they can allow their own hearts to be absorbed by absolute existence, by absolute love. And so that's the sense in which the mirror, the gaze of the jeweler, these images do function in an Augustinian way in the